The forest was thick, the kind that swallowed light and muffled sound, leaving only the occasional snap of a twig to mark a traveler's passage. He had been warned to keep away, that the woods were cursed, but curiosity gnawed at him, pulling him deeper into the tangle of trees. That was when he saw it, a cabin, half collapsed, vines strangling its timbers, yet unmistakably human in design. Smoke hadn't touched its chimney in decades, yet there was a strange warmth, as if the house itself exhaled a slow, measured breath. Whispers had drifted from nearby villages for years, tales of a man who called his sister wife and whose family had preserved an unbroken, grotesque bloodline. Now, the rumors pressed in on him with every step. The door creaked under his hand, and inside, the air was thick with decay and something far older, the scent of obsession, of rituals performed so long ago they had become a heritage. Shadows clung to corners, and the faint scratch of pen on paper drew him toward a table cluttered with yellowed journals, their ink faded but still legible. He read names that twisted the tongue, diaries that spoke of devotion, fear, and a singular, unbroken purpose to maintain a lineage untouched by outsiders. And then he heard it, a voice from deeper in the cabin, casual yet chilling. "Come here, my wife." The words sent ice into his veins. The man appeared from the shadows, eyes unnervingly calm, body twisted in ways that made his heritage grotesquely obvious. The forest beyond the cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting, as if the trees themselves knew he had trespassed into a family that should never have been. The discovery of the isolated cabin was like stepping into a space that had been deliberately cut off from the world, hidden beneath layers of overgrown foliage and the relentless grip of the forest. The hiker had been following a narrow, winding trail when he first noticed the sudden silence, the way the usual chorus of birds and rustling leaves seemed to vanish as he moved deeper into the trees. It was as if the forest itself recognized the presence of something unusual, and in its strange, almost sentient way, sought to warn or warn off intruders. Then, between a dense stand of oaks and twisted pines, the cabin appeared, half swallowed by the forest, its timbers blackened with age and weather, its roof sagging under the weight of decades of neglect. There was an undeniable human imprint in its construction, though nature had begun reclaiming it with creeping vines, moss, and the skeletal remains of long-dead shrubs that pressed against its walls. The path leading to it had been largely erased, trampled only by the passage of someone who did not care for secrecy, or perhaps by a lineage that had long understood the importance of isolation. Around the cabin, the air seemed heavier, carrying with it a faint, metallic tang that hinted at decay or perhaps blood long dried into the soil. The hiker felt an immediate, visceral unease, a shiver crawling along his spine as though he had stepped across a threshold where ordinary rules no longer applied. Small, unsettling details caught his attention. The door, slightly ajar as though inviting or daring him to enter, bore scratches and gouges, some old, some unnervingly fresh. Shards of broken glass from windows glittered like eyes watching silently, and faint footprints, partially obscured by leaves and debris, suggested that the cabin had seen visitors in the recent past. The forest around it seemed deliberately arranged to funnel the hiker's attention, shadows forming unnatural angles and gaps that hinted at movement just beyond the periphery of vision. He noticed symbols carved into the doorframe, crude yet deliberate, their meaning eluding him but sending a message of warning or ownership. As he approached, the silence became oppressive, punctuated only by the occasional groan of wood shifting under the strain of age, and the faint whisper of the wind threading through the broken panes. There was an unmistakable aura of history embedded in the cabin, not the benign history of a long-abandoned home, but something darker, an imprint of the lives and obsessions of those who had chosen to live apart from the world. Every detail, from the sagging roof to the overgrown path, seemed to speak of a lineage preserved in secrecy, a family removed from the outside gaze, waiting quietly, almost patiently, for anyone foolish enough to stumble across their threshold. The hiker felt a mixture of curiosity and dread, the pull of discovery tempered by the instinctual knowledge that this place was dangerous, that the cabin's story was alive in a way most homes are not, and that its hidden occupants might not be pleased by the intrusion. The first signs of the inbred man were subtle at first, hidden in whispers and half-forgotten tales told by villagers who never ventured near the forest's edge. The hiker, curious and cautious, had begun asking questions in the nearest town, a cluster of weathered buildings where everyone knew each other's histories, and everyone knew to speak of certain things only in hushed tones. The old men in the local diner exchanged uneasy glances when the subject arose, muttering fragments about a man who called his sister wife, a family that had kept itself isolated for generations, and children born with strange deformities or uncanny traits. They spoke of names erased from official records, of births that seemed to appear without documentation, and of a presence in the woods that had been feared for decades. It was in these fragmented stories that the hiker began to perceive a pattern, an obsessive devotion to bloodlines and secrecy that stretched back further than anyone cared to recount fully. He found old newspapers tucked away in dusty corners of the local library, yellowed and brittle, with brief mentions of disappearances, unusual illnesses, and rumors of a household that never welcomed outsiders. Each account was brief, often dismissed as folklore or hysteria, but together they formed a mosaic of something deeply unnatural. Villagers spoke of glimpses through the trees, of shadowy figures moving along paths no one else seemed to take, and of distant cries that could not be attributed to wind or wildlife. The hiker noticed that the further he delved, the more anxious people became, as if the act of inquiry itself was dangerous. They hinted that the family's influence was subtle but pervasive, extending through fear, superstition, and the very geography of the forest. At the edge of the village, he discovered old property records showing plots that had not changed hands for generations, all connected by a single family name, but with strange omissions where individuals should have appeared. These gaps, combined with oral histories, suggested a deliberate erasure, a desire to keep the lineage hidden and insulated from outsiders. Even the architecture of the region hinted at a deliberate separation, paths that twisted and doubled back, small structures camouflaged by trees, and fences that appeared abandoned but effectively corralled the property. As he pieced together these fragments, it became increasingly clear that the inbred man was not merely a product of twisted chance, but the culmination of decades, perhaps centuries, of careful isolation and obsessive preservation of bloodlines. Every hint he uncovered, from whispered warnings to faded records, was like a breadcrumb trail leading him closer to the cabin, to the threshold of the man himself, whose presence in the forest had shaped not only his family but the very landscape around them, twisting it into a maze of secrecy, fear, and unbroken devotion to a lineage that should never have survived. The unearthly sounds in the woods began almost imperceptibly, first as a faint rustling that seemed too deliberate to be the wind, too patterned to be the movement of animals. As the hiker ventured further along the twisted paths leading deeper into the forest, the usual chorus of nature, the chirping of birds, the whisper of leaves, grew sparse, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against his senses. Then came the first unmistakable sound, a low, guttural chant, distant yet resonant, threading through the trees with a rhythm that felt both ancient and ritualistic. It was as if the forest itself had become a conduit for something old, something that had persisted in the shadows long before his footsteps disturbed the soil. The tone of the chanting was unsettling, not just in its pitch but in its cadence, the way the words, though unintelligible, seemed to shape the very air, curling around the trunks and branches and pressing into his chest with a weight he could feel. Occasionally, a sharp cry would pierce the rhythm, a human-like wail that reverberated through the undergrowth and sent birds scattering in frantic flurries. Every time he thought the sound had moved away, it would return, closer, yet still impossible to locate precisely, as if the forest itself was shifting to conceal its source. Shadows lengthened unnaturally in the dim light, taking forms that resembled figures crouched just beyond vision, and the hiker's pulse quickened with the knowledge that he was being observed. He began noticing other signs, small clearings in the forest floor, each marked with faintly scorched earth or stones arranged in deliberate patterns, symbols that hinted at ceremonies performed in secrecy, their meanings long lost or deliberately obscured. The chanting sometimes seemed to come from these spaces, amplifying in volume and intensity before fading, leaving an eerie emptiness that made the trees themselves seem alive with expectation. The hiker felt a creeping dread, an awareness that he was intruding on something profoundly private, something maintained over generations and fiercely guarded. He tried to rationalize it, perhaps hunters, perhaps a hidden commune, but the rhythm of the sounds, the strange synchrony, and the unnatural silence surrounding them denied any mundane explanation. There was an intelligence behind it, a deliberate shaping of sound and silence that suggested the presence of someone or some family who understood the forest intimately, who could manipulate it to conceal their existence and instill fear in any who dared approach. Each note of chanting and cry heightened the sense of inevitability, of being drawn toward the source, a presence that waited in the dark recesses of the woods, patient, deliberate, and impossible to ignore, as though the very trees conspired to guide the hiker toward a truth he was not yet ready to face, and a revelation that would shatter any sense of normalcy he carried with him. The encounter with the inbred man arrived with a suddenness that made the hiker question whether he had imagined the shadows that moved before him. One moment he was following the faint trail through thick underbrush, and the next, a figure emerged from the gloom, standing in a small clearing just beyond the twisted trunks of ancient trees. At first, the man seemed almost human, yet something about his posture and the way his limbs twisted unnaturally betrayed the generations of inbreeding that had shaped him. His face carried features that were familiar and alien at once, eyes too close together, a jaw that seemed too narrow, and a smile that didn't quite reach the depths of his expression. He did not speak at first, only observing the hiker with an unnerving calm, tilting his head as though appraising a specimen. The hiker felt a chill crawl up his spine, an instinctive warning that this man was not merely a recluse or eccentric, but someone whose very existence had been sculpted by isolation and obsession. Then the words came, casual yet horrifying in their implication, "Come closer, my wife." The phrasing struck him like a physical blow, twisting the mind around the concept of familial perversion so casually embraced. The man's voice carried no malice in tone, only a bizarre intimacy that made the hiker's skin crawl, as if the man's mind could not distinguish between blood relation and marital bond, love and possession. As the hiker hesitated, the man stepped forward, each movement deliberate, almost ritualistic, his body unnaturally coiled in ways that suggested both strength and the subtle deformities of a lineage unbroken by outsiders. The forest around them seemed to close in, shadows pooling and stretching as though drawn toward the man, reinforcing the sense that the woods themselves were extensions of his presence. His eyes scanned the hiker with an unnerving depth, tracking every tremor of fear, every flicker of curiosity, and there was a precision in his observation that implied familiarity not just with the hiker's behavior, but with human behavior in general, honed over a lifetime of isolation and obsessive study. The clearing was silent except for the distant creak of branches and the soft rustle of leaves underfoot, but in that silence, the man's presence spoke volumes, radiating a sense of ownership and inevitability. The hiker realized with dawning horror that he was not merely encountering a person, but a culmination of generations devoted to secrecy, manipulation, and survival in a world that had forgotten them. Every step, every word, every movement from the man conveyed a lifetime of inherited knowledge, twisted morals, and relentless adherence to a family code that defied logic and humanity. In that moment, the hiker understood that this meeting was no accident, that he had been drawn here, guided by forces both natural and unnatural, toward a confrontation that would forever blur the line between observer and intruder, between fear and comprehension, and between what is considered normal and the deeply distorted reality of a family hidden from the world. The discovery of the hidden diaries was a turning point that transformed the hiker's curiosity into a creeping, suffocating dread. They were tucked away in a small, rotting chest under a sagging corner of the cabin, covered in layers of dust and cobwebs, as if deliberately concealed from anyone who might stumble upon them. The leather bindings were cracked, the pages brittle and yellowed with age, yet the ink remained dark enough to trace the words of a mind both meticulous and unhinged. As he flipped through the first diary, he realized immediately that these were not casual musings, but detailed records, written across decades, chronicling the family's obsessive adherence to preserving a bloodline through extreme measures. The entries described births, marriages, and relationships with a clinical precision, noting dates, physical characteristics, and the exact connections between individuals, as though cataloging a scientific experiment rather than human lives. There were sketches of faces, hands, and skeletal structures, drawn with painstaking accuracy, capturing deformities that recurred across generations, evidence of a deliberate and continuous inbreeding. The hiker's stomach churned as he read passages in which the author, clearly the forebear of the current inhabitant, wrote of the necessity of controlling who could marry whom, of isolating family members from outsiders, and of fostering loyalty through fear and religious or ritualistic devotion. Some entries detailed punishments for disobedience, obscure rites performed in the woods, and ceremonies intended to reinforce the lineage, some of which involved symbolic offerings or acts of symbolic union between close relatives. There was a chilling normalcy to the tone, as if cruelty and obsession were as mundane as preparing a meal. The diaries also revealed the mindset of the inbred man himself, showing how he had been raised in a culture that conflated blood with destiny, love with ownership, and family with an almost sacred hierarchy. In reading them, the hiker began to understand the psychology behind the man's casual declaration, calling his sister wife, and how this was not an anomaly but the intended outcome of generations of indoctrination and meticulous planning. The writing conveyed an eerie foresight, a careful grooming of successive generations to continue the family line, documenting each milestone as though he were both historian and priest of a perverse religion that worshipped blood continuity. As the hiker turned page after page, he realized the diaries were more than records, they were instructions, blueprints, and moral justification, a window into a mind that saw nothing wrong in twisting nature itself to achieve a singular, obsessive goal. Each diary, each entry, each sketch built upon the last, layering a horrifying clarity over the history of the family, revealing patterns of behavior, obsession, and control that had endured for decades, and making it impossible for the hiker to deny that he was witnessing the culmination of a legacy so twisted that it challenged comprehension, morality, and the very definition of what it meant to be human. The revelation of the sister's role hit the hiker with a weight of horror that was impossible to shake. She was not merely a passive figure in the family's twisted legacy, but an integral part of a system that had trapped her in a cycle of obedience and fear so complete that any thought of escape had long since been extinguished. The diaries hinted at her presence in careful, coded entries, noting her actions and reactions, recording her compliance with a disturbing precision, as though her life had been chronicled not as a person but as a vessel to serve the continuity of the bloodline. When the hiker finally saw her, she was silent, her movements cautious and deliberate, eyes darting between him and the man who had claimed her as wife, betraying a combination of fear, resignation, and an unsettling familiarity with control. She did not speak freely, and when she did, her words were measured, careful, revealing just enough to confirm the reality of her situation without inviting confrontation. It became evident that her existence had been shaped entirely by the family's doctrine. Every choice, every relationship, every act of resistance had been carefully monitored and often punished, leaving her conditioned to obey, yet aware of her own subjugation. The hiker sensed the duality of her position. She was both victim and participant, forced into complicity by necessity and survival, yet still aware of the immorality and horror of what the family had demanded. Her eyes, dark and haunted, flickered with the memory of rituals she had been compelled to witness or participate in, ceremonies designed to reinforce the family's obsession with blood and lineage, each act a grotesque affirmation of the ideology that had imprisoned her. She moved through the cabin with a grace born of repetition, performing tasks with efficiency, yet there was a hesitation in her gestures, a tension that spoke of years spent negotiating the fine line between obedience and survival. The hiker began to grasp the depth of her psychological conditioning, how isolation, fear, and indoctrination had merged into a worldview that left her powerless to resist entirely, yet aware enough to feel the weight of guilt, shame, and complicity. There was a strange, eerie dignity in her submission, a calm born of understanding that resistance could be fatal and compliance was the only path to survival. She represented the human cost of the family's obsession, a life carefully molded to serve a purpose that was neither voluntary nor moral, trapped in a hierarchy that demanded absolute loyalty and punished any deviation. The hiker realized that understanding her role was key to understanding the family itself, that she embodied the intersection of victimhood and agency, and that any hope of confronting the inbred man or escaping the forest required reckoning with the complex, terrifying reality of the sister who had become both prisoner and instrument of a lineage built on secrecy, fear, and unbroken devotion to a grotesque ideal. The revelation of the ritual was far more horrifying than the hiker could have anticipated, a grotesque performance that merged devotion, obsession, and the most twisted understanding of family loyalty. He had followed the sounds deeper into the woods, each step heavier with the knowledge that he was intruding on something sacred and forbidden, until he arrived at a clearing where the shadows seemed to move with a purpose of their own. There, the family had gathered, figures cloaked in darkness and secrecy, standing in precise formation around a central space that had been cleared of all vegetation, the earth marked with symbols that burned faintly in the moonlight, either by paint, ash, or some unknown substance that glimmered under the stars. The hiker could feel the vibrations of their voices before he could distinguish words, a low, monotonous chanting that seemed to pulse through the soil itself. At the center of the ritual, the man and his sister, referred to as wife, yet indistinguishable in their shared role, stood entwined, their movements deliberate, a strange mixture of reverence and coercion, as if their union was both celebrated and mandated by an unseen, inescapable law. The participants moved around them with synchronized motions, gestures that resembled the old texts the hiker had glimpsed in the diaries, actions that symbolized the preservation of the bloodline, the sanctity of their genetic continuity, and a devotion that bordered on religious fervor. The air was thick with the scent of earth, smoke, and something more metallic, primal, as though the forest itself had been complicit in shaping this perverse ceremony for generations. Each chant, each gesture, each carefully performed step reinforced the legacy of inbreeding, the obsessive insistence that the family must remain unbroken, untouched by outsiders, and free from dilution. The hiker's presence went unnoticed at first, yet he realized with growing dread that he was being observed by eyes in the darkness, some hidden behind trees, some closer than he could tell, and that any misstep could draw him into the ritual itself. There was an almost hypnotic quality to the ceremony, a rhythm and repetition that bound the participants together while simultaneously exerting a psychological hold on any witness, an implicit warning of the cost of intrusion. The realization hit him fully. This was not a single aberrant act, but the culmination of decades of tradition, meticulously preserved, rehearsed, and executed with unwavering devotion. The forest around the clearing seemed to pulse with their energy, the night air carrying the weight of countless previous ceremonies, each one reinforcing the same obsession, the same control, the same grotesque ideal. The hiker understood that the ritual was both a celebration and a reinforcement, a mechanism to maintain power, obedience, and the twisted sanctity of a bloodline that had survived in isolation for generations, a living testament to the family's ability to manipulate nature, morality, and human instinct to preserve something that should never have endured. The attempt to escape and the ensuing pursuit transformed the forest from a place of eerie fascination into a labyrinth of pure terror. As the hiker realized the full extent of the ritual he had witnessed, a deep instinctual fear gripped him, and every nerve in his body screamed to retreat from the clearing, away from the family whose obsession had been meticulously cultivated over generations. At first, he retraced his steps along the faint trail he had used to enter, only to find that the path seemed altered, twisted in ways that defied memory and expectation. Trees that had been on one side now appeared on the other, familiar landmarks seemed to vanish, and small clearings became dense thickets as though the forest itself had reorganized to impede his flight. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, merging with the undergrowth, creating illusions of movement that made him stumble or hesitate, each pause amplifying the feeling that he was being hunted. Then came the first sound, a low, deliberate crunch of leaves and twigs behind him, precise and measured, too deliberate to belong to any ordinary creature. He glanced back, catching a fleeting silhouette, tall, gaunt, moving with an eerie grace that seemed almost unnatural, like a predator who understood the terrain intimately. Panic surged, and he broke into a sprint, stumbling over roots and rocks, lungs burning, heart hammering in his chest. Every direction he tried seemed to loop back upon itself, and every clearing appeared identical, as though the forest were a maze designed not by chance but by careful cultivation over decades. The cries and whispers he had once dismissed as distant echoes now echoed close behind him, voices chanting his name or words he could not comprehend, yet resonating with an authority that twisted his perception of space and time. At intervals, he caught glimpses of figures slipping between the trees, always at the periphery of vision, never fully revealed, yet their presence was unmistakable. Fear became a tangible weight pressing against his chest, a physical force that made movement laborious. He understood with grim clarity that the pursuit was not random, that the family or the inbred man himself knew these woods as extensions of their will, capable of bending paths, shadows, and sound to trap those who intruded. Even the wind seemed to conspire against him, carrying voices and rustling leaves in ways that disoriented him, masking the true direction of safety. As exhaustion threatened to overtake him, he realized that escape would not simply be a matter of speed or endurance. It required understanding the rules of a place that had been shaped for secrecy, obedience, and fear, a forest that was as alive as it was treacherous, and whose hidden occupants had been waiting, patient and deliberate, for any outsider foolish enough to venture too close, testing the limits of instinct, courage, and sanity at every turn. The man's obsession intensified with every moment the hiker remained within reach, a palpable force that seemed to warp the very air of the forest and bend the shadows toward him. After the failed escape attempt, the inbred man appeared with an uncanny awareness, emerging from the trees as though he had been watching all along, anticipating every movement, predicting each step before it was taken. There was a meticulousness in his approach, a cold deliberation that suggested decades spent observing human behavior in isolation, studying fear, hesitation, and the subtle betrayals of instinct. His eyes, unnervingly calm, followed the hiker with a mixture of curiosity and authority, a predator who did not merely hunt for survival but for the preservation of obsession. The man began speaking, his voice low and deliberate, laced with an intimacy that made the forest itself seem complicit, echoing each word and amplifying the weight of his obsession. He spoke of lineage, of blood, and of destiny, insisting that the hiker was no mere intruder but part of a network of inheritance that had long been concealed. Each word was a claim, each phrase a manipulation designed to erode resistance, bending perception until reality itself felt unstable. He hinted at a shared heritage, implying that the hiker too was bound by the invisible chains of blood, a participant in a cycle meticulously preserved for generations, and that to deny this connection would be to deny a truth too profound and ancient to escape. The forest seemed to respond to his obsession, leaves quivered without wind, shadows coalesced unnaturally, and the hiker could feel a presence pressing from every direction, constricting space, guiding him subtly toward confrontation. The man's obsession was not merely psychological but ritualistic, embedded in the landscape and the air, as though the forest itself had been trained to enforce his will. Every motion he made, every gesture of the hand, seemed rehearsed, a deliberate choreography meant to assert dominance and unsettle perception, reinforcing the inevitability of submission. The hiker realized the intensity of the obsession was cumulative, inherited and honed over decades, each generation adding layers of psychological control, ritual practice, and moral distortion that shaped not just the inbred man but the very environment around him. The dialogue, the gestures, the proximity of the man all conspired to make resistance seem impossible, framing the hiker not as a visitor but as a participant in a destiny he had not chosen. There was an inexorability to the encounter, a sense that escape, understanding, or survival could only exist within the confines of the rules set by the man's obsession, and that the forest, the family, and the inbred man himself were all instruments of the same unyielding purpose: to preserve a lineage, enforce obedience, and assert control over anyone who dared enter the hidden, claustrophobic world they had meticulously constructed over generations. The uncertain ending lingered like a shadow over the hiker's mind, a weight that refused to lift even as he finally broke free from the immediate presence of the cabin and the forest's oppressive grasp. He emerged into the fringes of the woods, the dim glow of dawn filtering through the trees, yet the relief he felt was fragile, tempered by the knowledge that the horrors he had witnessed were not confined to memory alone. The images of the man, the sister, the ritual, and the meticulously preserved bloodline remained vivid, etched into his mind with a clarity that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. Villagers who had whispered warnings now seemed to him both wise and tragic, carriers of knowledge that he had only begun to understand, and yet their fragmented stories could never have prepared him for the depth of obsession and isolation he had encountered. As he made his way along the familiar trail, he found himself constantly glancing over his shoulder, every shadow and rustle of leaves triggering the same primal fear that had kept him frozen in the forest. The encounter had altered his perception of the world beyond the trees. The idea of normalcy now seemed tenuous, as if the family and their hidden domain existed in parallel with the life he had once known, a dark undercurrent running beneath the surface of society. Questions gnawed at him relentlessly. How many more families, like the one he had encountered, had remained hidden in the folds of forests and mountains, insulated from the world yet thriving in secrecy? How had the forest itself seemed complicit, its paths bending, its shadows guiding, and its sounds echoing the obsessive will of the inbred man? He realized that the encounter was not a single, isolated incident, but part of a broader truth about isolation, obsession, and human capacity for perverse preservation. The sister's haunted eyes, the precise choreography of the rituals, the obsessive documentation in diaries, all of it suggested a civilization apart, governed by rules that defied ordinary morality, yet executed with a terrifying logic of survival and continuity. Even as he returned to the familiarity of towns and roads, The sense of being watched, of being tracked, remained palpable, a lingering presence that refused to dissipate. He could feel the family's influence stretching beyond the immediate forest, embedded in folklore, in whispered warnings, and in the very geography of the region, as though the memory of their obsession had seeped into the land itself. The hiker understood that survival had been contingent on timing, instinct, and luck, that the forest had allowed him to leave, but not without leaving an indelible mark on his psyche. The horror of what he had witnessed would shadow him indefinitely, a reminder that the human mind and the natural world could combine in ways both intimate and alien, nurturing obsessions that outlasted generations and leaving questions with no resolution, truths that remained hidden yet palpable, and a certainty that some legacies are too twisted to ever be fully forgotten or comprehended by the ordinary world.